Our scripture comes from 1 Kings 17, verses 7 through 16. Elijah and the widow. Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, "Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food." So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" As she was going to get it, he called, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said, but first, make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. Then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." She went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah, and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. Blessings, Dwight.
How many of you as parents have ever heard from your children, "There is nothing to eat in this place"? And yet, the cabinets are full, the refrigerator is full. It's just not the right kind of food, is it? Most of us here this morning do not need to worry about where our next meal is coming from. When it comes to food, we have what we need. In fact, most of us have more than we need, as you can see is the case with me. We are blessed with the food that we need. We have more than we need. And out of our abundance, each year, we as a congregation deliver about 200 Thanksgiving food boxes 10 days before Thanksgiving. We have plenty. And so we share. But what if you were down to your last loaf of bread? The refrigerator is empty. The cupboards are bare. You simply have one loaf of bread. And God says to you, donate that loaf of bread to the Thanksgiving food boxes. Would you do it? Would you do it? Would you have enough faith that God will provide if you gave Him all that you had? Would you be able to give generously in the midst of your emptiness? The widow in our story this morning is asked to bake a loaf of bread for the prophet Elijah from the last little bit of flour that she has in her house. Can you imagine being asked that question? In verse 12 of our text this morning, this is how she replies to Elijah. "As surely as the Lord your God lives, I don't have any bread. Only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and then die. This is all she has. A handful of flour and a little bit of oil. That's all she has. And Elijah comes and says, "Make me a loaf of bread." She is in a very bleak situation. A situation so bleak that I cannot imagine being in her situation. What would you do? What would I do in her situation? Why would Elijah make such a request of this widow? Well, let's take a look. In 1 Kings 17 is the first time we have mention of the prophet Elijah. In verse 1 in chapter 17, we learn this. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word." Ahab is the current king of Israel. If you turn back a chapter to chapter 16 in 1 Kings, we learn that there is this succession of kings of Israel who is doing more evil in the sight of God than the one before him. 1 Kings 16, 29 to 33, we learn a little bit about King Ahab. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel, and he reigned in Samaria for 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he had built in Samaria. Ahab made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than all the kings before him. And so we have this king who has done evil, doing evil in the sight of God. And so God sends Elijah to him. Elijah says there's not going to be any rain for the next few years. God is preparing Ahab for the confrontation that we would read about in chapter 18 of 1 Kings. But we find God taking care of Elijah during this lack of rain and the famine that results. God tells Elijah to go to Kerith ravine, which is east of the Jordan. There he would drink from a brook, and the ravens would feed him. So the ravens actually fed him. Morning and evening, they brought him meat. They brought him bread, and he drank from the brook. Let me see a show of hands. How many of you would eat bread and meat brought to you by a raven? But one day, because of the lack of rain, the brook dries up. So what now? God tells Elijah to move on from that place. Go to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow to supply you with food. And so Elijah moves on. He arrives at Zarephath. He's approaching the town gate, and there is this widow collecting sticks. Elijah casually asks her for a drink of water. In her graciousness, she turns to go get him a glass of water. And as she's going, he calls out to her and says, "Oh, by the way, bring me some bread as well." And it is that moment that Elijah learns that this widow doesn't have any bread. All she has is this little bit of flour and this little bit of oil. Elijah's got to be thinking, I don't know if this is the right widow. I thought God directed her to supply me with food. I'm not sure about this whole situation here. Now, I am not much of a baker, and so I had to go on Google and look up a recipe for a simple loaf of bread. A simple loaf of bread, according to Google and the research that I found, is it takes about 3 cups of flour and 2 cups of olive oil to bake a loaf of bread. 3 cups. The widow had a handful. Now, this is my handful. This is a half a cup of flour. Will she really go and make a loaf of bread for Elijah? Why would Elijah ask the widow with so little to make him bread? Elijah instructs the widow, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Go and make me some bread. And he tells her that the oil and the flour will not be used up until the Lord sends rain again. She goes and makes the loaf of bread. And there's enough for Elijah. There is enough for her son, and there is enough for her. In fact, day after day, she continues to make bread, and the flour and the oil are not used up. God honored this widow for her faith, for her obedience, and for her generosity. This widow was generous in the midst of her emptiness. Jesus, in fact, recognized this widow for her faith, as we read in Luke chapter 4, verses 25 to 26, where Jesus says, I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. There wasn't a widow in all of Israel that had the faith that this widow had in Zarephath. And then because of that, she provided food for Elijah and for her family, even though she had so little. So what is it that we learn from this story? 3 things. First, I believe we must have faith when God calls us to do something. When God calls, He provides the way, even though we can't see the end result, even though it seems impossible to accomplish. Jesus tells us if we have the faith the size of a mustard seed, we can move mountains. This widow moved a mountain. By faith, Peter stepped out of the boat and walked on water. It wasn't until he took his focus off of Jesus that he sank into the water and needed Jesus' help to bring him out. It is when we keep our eyes on Jesus that we can do the impossible. All things are possible through Him who gives me strength. Second, we need to be obedient when God calls. This widow, I'm sure, had questions. I don't have enough for you, for me and my son. She was afraid of giving up her last bit of flour to bake a loaf of bread for Elijah. We often, too, are afraid to do what God asks us to do. We say to ourselves, well, I just can't do that right now. Or, I don't have the ability to accomplish that. I can't do that. Or, I don't have the time. Right now, things are really hectic. I just don't have the time to do that. Or maybe our response is, I don't have enough money to take care of that. Find somebody else. We can come up with all kinds of reasons / excuses. But it is in those times where God says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I will be with you. I will provide for you. When we are obedient, God doesn't let the flour or the oil run out. He provides everything we need to accomplish whatever He has called us to do. Third, we need to be generous. Jesus tells His disciples in Matthew chapter 10, verses 7 and 8, these words, "As you go, proclaim this message. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Freely you have received, freely give." God has freely given to us, and so we can also be free to give. The widow gave generously, even though she had little. In verse 12, we learned that she had no bread left. The last loaf of bread that she baked was already gone. All she had was this handful of flour, this little bit of oil, and it was going to make a very small loaf of bread. This is what she was willing to give to Elijah. Or should we say, this is what she was willing to give to God. Everything she had. This widow reminds me of the poor widow that Jesus watched as He was watching people put money into the temple treasury. All the rich people came through and put in large amounts of money. And then this poor widow comes along and she puts in 2 very small copper coins. Jesus tells His disciples, this widow put in more than all the others because in her poverty, she gave all she had to live on. The rich had given out of their wealth. How do we respond with our giving? Are we giving just out of our wealth? Most of us, if not all of us here this morning, are not down to our last handful of flour and our little bit of oil. What is God asking me to give? How can I give generously? Could it be that when I think I have given enough, I need to give some more? A little bit more? A lot more? Could it be that I should spend more time in prayer so I know exactly what God is asking me to give? Right now, within our church, we have opportunities to give. There are numerous opportunities to give. Sometimes we're overwhelmed with the number of opportunities we have to give. There are 10 MCC boxes under the coat rack in the foyer waiting to be filled with groceries to be taken to the ACC assembly this Saturday. As Galen mentioned, you can sign up online or on the foyer table to donate food to the Thanksgiving food boxes. 200 of them, about 200 will be delivered on November 12th. They are a complete Thanksgiving meal. There are Wednesday night out meal fundraisers that support various missions of this congregation. This week just happens to be the senior high youth group as they prepare to go on a mission trip next summer. We can give to Mennonite Disaster Service, who's overwhelmed with the work that they have as a result of the hurricanes this summer. Or Mennonite Central Committee, who provides for the needs of people around the world and are providing for the needs of people in Puerto Rico as a result of the hurricane. Maybe at this time you're not giving to our weekly offering. Is God asking you to give regularly to the mission of this church? There are many opportunities. What is God calling you to give? What is God calling you to give? I pray that I will have the faith to act obediently and to give generously as God has called us to give. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Freely we have received, so that we may freely give and give generously. Amen.